Thank you for downloading my podcast, Therapists Talking Therapy. My name is Martin Weaver. In this episode, I'm joined by Ike Odina, and we'll be talking about what is our job, how we define what it is that we do. I last spoke to Ike in July 2020 when he joined myself and my colleague Nicholas Rose to talk about practice culture and Black Lives Matter. In July 2020, Ike introduced himself by saying he didn't like labels. But for those of you who haven't heard that episode, let me just sketch out Ike by saying he's a British-born Nigerian man, a husband and father, self-described as middle class. Professionally, he works as a psychotherapist, a supervisor, and a college trainer in existential psychotherapy. So here we are. It's been 18 months or so, 16 months since we did our last podcast on Black Lives Matter, and the world still continues,
Yep.
Things still happen.
Injustice is still there in different guises, as it were, still there.
Yeah, at the moment, it's more, I guess, as we're talking, it's more about immigrants, people fleeing from places that probably you and I might not even be able to understand, willing to risk their lives to come here.
Yeah, and I was having this discussion with a few other people as well, and it comes down to, well, it doesn't come down to, but it's all up in the air. But you start to think, why here? But then you go back in history, and everybody has had some sort of dealings with someone else. And so that's the link. I'll go to England, I'll go to America because someone way back, whether 100 years ago, 50 years ago, they've had some link, and that's the reason why people choose to make that. You and I sit here in the comfort of our homes here, and we think, why on earth would you leave your home soil, treacherous waters, and venture? It's just crazy.
Well,
but
yes and no. It's not so much why are they coming here, but more the question is, what are they actually trying to get away from? Why?
Indeed.
How is this a better place to be as a survival strategy?
Yeah.
They're thinking about, I suppose, too much.
And if we have clients like that who show up in our therapy rooms, where do we start in terms of working with them?
Well, that brings us nicely round to, what is our job? A couple of things have happened recently. I've been involved in the audit from UKCP that I've spoken about elsewhere. And there was that program on BBC about the regulation of psychotherapists, which got me to thinking and talking to you, given you're a lecturer, given that you actually teach people this stuff.
Yeah.
I spoke to you initially and I said, what is our job? And you asked the question about, are we simply fixers?
Yeah. And the whole thing about objectivity came up, didn't it?
Yeah.
What is our job? And obviously pondering on that since we talked about it, couldn't help thinking of us, like modern day priests, where people come along and give their confessionals, as it were. The scripture about confess your sins one to another, as it were. And so with that in mind, you think clients come to us for a better understanding of who they are, where they are, what they are, how they are. Probably why they are as well. So it's that lovely, who, what, why, where, how, and so they come for a better understanding of that, and I guess fresh perspective, which kind of segues us into that. Are we objective?
Well,
Sorry, go.
I would say, do we need to be?
that's where, because if we agree to work with the person, by default, we have bought into their desire to find a different way or understand themselves. That's one, but pursue maybe a new chosen path, as it were. I mean, we might ask the challenging questions, but as part of our guidelines, we don't advise people one way or the other. But I guess by sitting in the room, we are entertaining that person's, unless it's, as we know, going to harm themselves or someone else. But we don't know tomorrow, do we? So what looks like something wonderful today might pan out to something not so wonderful tomorrow.
And the equal argument is that what seems dreadful today, someone talking about suicide, might not be dreadful tomorrow.
Yeah.
And so we deal with that uncertainty.
Mm. Mm. With our clients, exactly.
Well, and with ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Here we are. How long have you been working as a therapist?
Quarter of a century.
And me, 20 years.
Yeah.
And here we are talking about what are we doing?
Yeah.
And how do we describe it?
Yeah.
How do you and I guess, teach it, which is perhaps a later question. And a further question, how do we measure that? Which is what regulation is about. So we need to come right back to the beginning and say, what are we doing?
Yep.
What are we doing?
What are we doing?
And you talked earlier on about being priests, and as an ex-Catholic, I understand what you mean by that, because some clients have said over the years, Martin, they said, I feel like I'm coming here to kind of get absolution or to confession, to get approval, possibly. And so maybe it's about not what is our job, but what are our jobs.
Yeah, and that might differ for different clients.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And as I'm thinking about that, there's something about how we then, because your question about can we be completely objective is what you actually asked.
That's what I asked, wasn't it?
Yeah. Have you got caught up in the kind of scientific
absolutism, as it were?
Yeah. To boil this down, to focus this down to a questionnaire or to
empiricism, and all that. We can't, because we're dealing with people, isn't it?
Well, yes, we are, but forgive me, that sounds like a kind of magic statement. Yes, we are dealing with people. So it's a complex system. So in which case there is some reductionism that has to happen.
If we're working to some sort of common objective, as it were, then we can say, we're, the both parties in the room, as it were, going towards a certain goal.
Yeah.
Okay. Then it makes it easier to measure. But this is, I guess, at the beginning of therapy, the more you think about it, the beginning of therapy is probably the safest point, because what you're bringing, and you hear the client for the first time, then you can either at that point say, yes, we can work together, or not. But the moment you say yes and the client says yes, really it's open season, really, isn't it? Because you don't know what that client's going to bring, and they have no idea what your response might be. And though you might set things in place in the early stages in terms of your working alliance, and you're working towards, you agree, where you might be going in general, the client, in a way, is in the driving seat. And so they might come 4 weeks later and take you on some other journey. And this is where that question about objectivity came in, was if you were not being objective, if you were being objective completely, you'd just follow that client wherever they're going, wouldn't you? But you see, this is where it gets. But if you're saying we're working towards this goal that we have both agreed, or this general area, where we've agreed, then you're going to start steering the client by asking that question: how does that fit in with what we agreed?
Objectivity.
What does the good old Oxford Dictionary say? You got Webster's or the Oxford Dictionary?
Well, because you're talking there about being completely objective. Then it's about, does that mean you're standing outside of the system?
We kind of set ourselves up to do that, or to try to do that, don't we?
Free from bias.
Free from bias.
So I've got a broader perspective because I'm not involved in the client's system.
Uh-huh.
I haven't got what was recently called skin in the game. It doesn't really matter to me whether my people stay together, whether my client reports the abuse to the police, or whether they forgive themselves or somebody else. Ultimately, it doesn't really affect me. So my question: the more
you get to know the client, you because there's now not a vested interest, but you have, on some levels, an emotional connection with this client. You understand this client a bit better, and it's all based on what they've told you. Because it's only that hour that you have, and you're making all your interventions, conjecture, and so on and so on, based on the 1 hour that you have with this client. But the more you get to know each client based on what they've said, you are buying more and more into their way of being, aren't you?
Well, you're accepting the boundaries, the rules, the beliefs that they are living by. So one could argue that the noose gets tighter, in the sense the freedom gets less because of the relationships and the beliefs. And part of our role is that whole, if not unloosening of that, of the providing of options from my perspective, choices, not just, oh, you could do this, that, or the other, but resourcing the client so that these choices then become meaningful and they understand the consequences. And maybe that hour is the only time in the week or the month, or maybe the only time they ever have, to think about the different possibilities and the consequences.
So would you say this is where we become biased?
Well, we are biased from the outset, and we need to acknowledge that for ourselves.
That might be a better way.
I think I said in a previous podcast, I'm a white, middle-class, able-bodied, cisgendered male, gay male. There's all those sorts of things that are part of my subjective experience. And here you are, we started talking about people moving from one country to ours. And you're saying, why do they do that? Well, that's a kind of judgment, isn't it? You're being less than objective there, because if you were objective, you say, I need to go and find out.
Yeah,
know that.
But that's based on, of course, that's based on my bias. Why? Considering all the things you'd have to, and I've jumped, is it worth it? And so on, all that sort of thing. But yes, there's a judgment there, isn't there?
And if you were an ist, sexist, racist, any ist you want to put in that, then you would claim not your biases, because you claim that as your truth. And therefore you'd be measuring the other against your truth and judging the other against your truth. And therefore you wouldn't be free from bias. they wouldn't even acknowledge there was bias. If only they pulled their socks up, worked harder, and worked within the system, then they'd be quite happy.
That's an interesting one, isn't it?
If only you'd stop thinking about being black, for heaven's sake.
Just get on with it.
Let's get on with it. Yeah, absolutely. If only you'd stop thinking about, you're not as rich as anybody else and just accepted where you are. That would be bias, wouldn't it?
Interesting.
Part of our training is to say, but you are black and I am white.
Yeah.
I was born in Guildford, you were born in Nigeria. There's a whole different cultural setup there. And without making negative judgments, to put those on the table. I
was actually born in England, if you remember. But I spent ages out there, yeah.
That's what I remember, yeah.
That's what.
Yeah.
So, even saying that's a brilliant example there, because compared to people who were born in Nigeria,
yeah, we
might have different. We definitely would have different views.
Yeah,
and both be black, both be Nigerian, but the fact that I have a different upbringing than them, that will be seen as a cause for.
Well, but that's the whole point, isn't it? For us as therapists, it would be seen as different, whereas for others, it might not be seen as different.
So, can we lock up our biases?
No, and I don't think we should.
I think I agree with you.
So
I agree with you.
So part of what our job is to acknowledge our own place and position
from the very beginning.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I remember being asked the question, or the question being thrown out there, do we have an agenda? And it's very much along the same lines, isn't it? And it's, you just think, goodness, do we have an agenda? And, the guys chewed on that for a little while.
Was there any development of what we meant by agenda?
It was in terms of, clients. It was this whole thing about, that our textbooks would say, oh, it's trying to be objective, it's be a blank slate, be this. And we were looking at the practicality of that in the room with the client. And it just didn't work. And that's the bottom line. As we said, the client comes to you first of all, as a fellow human being.
Yeah.
As a fellow human being. That's the commonality, isn't it? You are a human being like me. You are imperfect. Okay. You set some things in place. This session is for you. It's not about me. It's about you. So as much as possible, we'll try and keep it to you. But this is, and this is where the first session, this is who I am. Yeah. I always say to clients, the first session, what made you pick me? Have you run other practitioners? Why'd you settle with me? And you hear their views, And so coming back to that whole thing about, do we have an agenda? It's an interesting one, because it all comes down to this centered bias, isn't it?
So, but if we think, from my perspective, that all life is subjective, the question is not, do we have an agenda, but what is the agenda?
Is the agenda.
And how useful is that? Is it useful for a client to come in who's in distress, and my agenda to be, I want this client to be not in distress, to be in comfort or contentment? And the speed.
I guess this is, I guess this is where our guidelines come in, isn't it? Because they help us to. The more you think about it, the guidelines are simply guidelines, aren't they? They're not set in stone.
And what are they guiding?
Well, I think it's this very same thing, isn't it? Like, this is a great example you gave, where a client comes in distressed. Now, it sounds fair that they've come to you to be relieved of that distress.
or be other than distressed.
Well, and so if your agenda is to work with that client to be relieved of that stress, that's a fair objective, isn't it?
I would think so, as a starting point.
As a starting point, okay. And this is where our guidelines come in. As long as you don't harm the client and all the other,
But that then brings into conversation the issue of risk.
Well,
because I don't want to harm the client, but maybe there are questions or areas of their lives that we need to explore that are uncomfortable or even painful. Maybe the client needs to realize it wasn't their fault, or it was their fault, or they are responsible, or they're not responsible. And that whole shift of that, their own subjective reality.
Maybe this is what our training program should be. Can you teach risk?
I have been taught ideas about risk. What we think is risky, how we identify risk. What risks are we willing to take? I often say that our clients take a huge risk in coming to see us. What risk as practitioners are we willing to take? To ask the question that's uncomfortable.
That's it. And that's it.
And some of my students say, I may have said this to you, they said, I couldn't possibly ask that question. That's far too uncomfortable. And I said, well, that's the job. If that's what your client needs, it doesn't matter whether you don't like it or don't like it. If that's what the client needs, what are you going to do? So teaching risk is like practicing that.
Yeah. And you think of other professions, doctors, lawyers, and it almost comes second nature to ask those difficult questions, and they put it under fact finding. But they need those facts to make a case, as it were. And lawyers especially get really upset. You left out that fact, because you made me look like an idiot on the stand and so on and so forth. But you left out an important piece of information.
Maybe that's where the difference is, that if we were to speak to them, I wonder how connected they are to their clients. You talked about investment in the client as you get to know the client. So maybe we don't teach our students enough to make that connection and then to step back from it.
I always think of that pendulum of the grandfather clock, isn't it?
Yeah. To connect and then disconnect.
Regularly.
Yeah.
Regularly.
And by that process, we can grow and learn what our biases are, what our clients' biases are, and bring those in a Gestalt kind of way into the foreground.
Into the fore, exactly. Yeah.
So maybe our job is to ask the difficult questions.
Indeed.
Was it Bronowski said? They sent a man. He said, what's he said about ask the impertinent question, and you're on your way to the pertinent answer. So ask a bold question, and you're on your way to a really useful answer, a focused answer.
Yeah.
And impertinence is such an English kind of word, isn't it?
Yes, it's almost bordering on rude,
Yeah.
And, how dare you, but it needs to be asked, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And I guess this is where the skill, how you ask the question comes in.
Yeah. And that connection to the client and that agenda, if you like, and I guess it needs to be a shared agenda and regularly reviewed. And sometimes I say to my clients, we're deep in an issue, and I have to come back, pull myself back and say, well, is this a problem? Is this how we want to spend our time? Are we going in the right direction?
That's That's an interesting one.
Has our agenda diverted or diverged?
Yeah.
Is what I want for you what you want for you?
I guess this is where good supervision comes in, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Okay.
And somehow,
I recently asked a couple why they were married, why they got married.
yeah.
And gave them a week to think about it. Now, I just wonder if this was at the beginning of my career, would I have asked that question?
And what would have stopped you?
Need for hours. Oh my God, my, will they come back? And, all those, yeah. Well, I don't think, gave it some thought, the necessary, well, I say necessary amount of thought, but it was a question that needed to be asked.
Mm.
And it was the first thing we addressed the moment they, next session.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about this, we've thought about this, and this is our answer. Okay. And then my next question was, okay, where do you want to go from here?
Yeah. So are you able to describe what your intent was and what you were doing in that process?
Very existentially, get them to take responsibility for the position they found themselves in.
And to take responsibility, they had to understand or bring into the foreground or make explicit not only the decision they've made and the reasons behind it.
Yeah. So that was the rationale behind that. And just to give them some time to actually think about everything, is this the way they want to continue? Yeah.
So it is, in a sense, perhaps part of our job is to bring clients out of their subjectivity, maybe into our subjectivity, in order to get a different shape to themselves.
I would very much agree to that. It's because they see, very often clients, you get that impression that they're the only ones going through this.
Well, that's true. And yet I guess I'm thinking it's more a case of about, I think it's an old philosophical question Bertrand Russell spoke about, when you're in the system, it's difficult to think about the system. And we have a kind of fudge, if you like, where we imagine or believe that we can step outside the system and we can reflect our clients back to themselves, rather like in supervision or in our own therapy. I don't know if you remember when a supervisor or a therapist has said, well, like, it seems to me it's more like this than that. And because you've been so locked into this,
you can't see
that.
Yeah.
When you do notice and see that, everything kind of shifts.
Yeah.
And maybe that's what our job is.
And maybe that's that sense of objectivity that we were talking about, isn't it? That constant movement. So our roles are very dynamic. You're in the client's world and you're back out.
Oh yeah, in my training, we kept talking about outcomes in the first couple of years, I guess, and they were seemed to be very kind of fixed. You were doing one thing, but then it occurs to me, and I often say to my supervisees and trainees, an outcome can last 10 minutes, 5 minutes, because as soon as you identify the outcome, the whole system changes anyway. And the outcome you started off with at the beginning of the session might very well not be the outcome you arrive at the end of the session. I don't know how you prepare as all of your clients,
Mm.
but I ask my clients before they turn up, what do you want? And get them to, or ask them to jot down some ideas.
Yeah.
And then we'll reflect back on that. And sometimes at the end of the first session, they'll say, oh, really? None of that seems relevant now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
However, and we're on to the next bit.
Yeah. It's almost like consequences having their own consequences, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And you mentioned a minute ago about us being dynamic. And part of our role, part of our job, I guess, is not only to to stoke that dynamism, but to be willing to hold it. Not necessarily to control it or direct it, but simply to hold the process.
Yeah, there's our management bit, isn't it?
And not to be afraid of it. And if we are aware of our own biases, then we know where, when the client says something, and sometimes I'll say to myself, is that my stuff or is that the client's stuff? And park my stuff. And that's part of our training, how to do that.
Okay.
And then be with the client again in order, I would say, to give that different degree of subjectivity. You might call it being objective, because we're feeding back to the client.
Yeah, it's all degrees, isn't it?
Yeah. And how you measure that is anyone's guess.
Yes. Earlier on, you said it's a bold move, a very courageous move of our clients to show up for therapy. I guess if you're taking a very long-term approach, you could look at every session as measurement, really.
The fact they turn up at all, you mean?
Yeah. I mean, if you consider having asked an impertinent question, and they show up the next session, even if they're angry with you, you know, and at some point in that session, they let rip at you. And, as a therapist, you are just leaping for joy on the inside because they've shown up, but they've also had the courage to let you know exactly how they feel about this.
Yeah.
It's difficult to quantify that sort of progress, but you can certainly qualify it.
And how do you teach that kind of progress?
Well, indeed. But you talked about holding and managing and not being afraid.
Yeah.
And I think if your client can see that you can ask that pertinent question, you can challenge them and still remain there with them, having said right at the very, very beginning, you will do this, and part of your role is to stay with them. You're not running away. You're not going anywhere. You're here. And I think once they see that and there's a consistency, might sound cliche, but they feel safe with you, safe and secure, in order to explore those uncomfortable things.
And so maybe part of our job when we get there, part of our learning, is the willingness and the, I want to say, experience, the practice, if you like, of coping with that stress, of coping with that disturbance.
Yeah, I prefer the word practice. Yeah, I prefer the word practice because it's something we get better at it, but we're still practicing, isn't it?
Well, yes, we are. And to get where we are, 45 years together, if we had our experience together, whatever, there's something about, it's a dynamic process. It's not something you can learn from a book.
Yeah.
It is about in the moment. It's almost like, I suppose, maybe it's not so much a training, more of an apprenticeship.
Yeah.
There's an amount of theory to learn, an amount of language to learn, but most importantly, it's experiential.
Yeah.
Getting out
the line. Yeah, it's the doing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Completely agree with that. Yeah. I often ask. It may just be there as a provocative question. I often ask supervisees when they plan to go into private practice.
Yeah. Oh, I go even further. I just look at them and say, "Are you a therapist?" Trainees particularly, and they go, "Oh, are you a therapist? Yes or no?"
One, if we were new in the profession, you had a client, and somebody walked into the room. It's not the end of the world, is it?
Yeah.
You would find a way. It's real life.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you would find, as you say, you would find a way of dealing with it. You would ask your client how they feel.
Yeah.
Are they still okay? And so on and so forth. Most people are quite robust, aren't they?
Well, yes.
So, yeah.
And one of the words I wrote down earlier on was trust. And that's not only just trust in the process, but trust in ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the willingness to engage in really whatever happens.
Yeah.
And although we have an investment, as you pointed out at the beginning of this conversation, in our clients getting better, feeling better, then it's simply about trusting in ourselves that we can engage with whatever happens. And that comes with, as we've been saying, comes with practice.
It does. Yeah. Yeah.
So do you feel any closer to answering the question, what is our job?
What is our job? I think we've described it.
Yeah.
We've certainly described it. What is our job? We're not fixers. Can't think of a particular
enablers.
Enablers. That word sort of travelled from ear to ear, and I let it go out. Enablers. What are we enabling?
Well, that leads me to think more and more. I have been disenchanted for some time with our profession's desire to ride upon the coattails of the medical profession. And I would much rather call myself, anyway, an educator. So teaching my clients about their life and themselves so they can teach themselves. And I am expert in some things. They are expert in who they are. Albeit
that sits well with me, actually.
Yeah.
And
so it's a lot of it, we talk about this, something you and I have been doing for 90% of our, 100% of our
work
profession.
Yeah.
And now this word psychoeducation has suddenly become.
Exactly. Yeah. When you said education, because people are just bandying it around, I keep thinking, well, yeah, but yes, I'm doing this for a long time.
Exactly. But now we have a label for it. Now it's been deemed acceptable and valuable.
Yeah. So, but yeah, educator definitely sits much better.
I think so.
Yeah. I would go with that.
People come to me people come to me with a focus in their subjective world on their job or their family or survival or whatever.
Yeah.
They haven't spent the time that you and I have spent and our students and colleagues have spent unpicking how the world is put together, how we put the world together.
Yeah.
And that's what I educate.
Yeah.
My clients. I'm somewhat shocked in some senses about how little people know about their own bodies, their own physiology. We stopped when you and I went to school. We probably had, and I certainly remember having grammar lessons and parsing, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Now, or soon after that, it went to just express yourself, which I understand, except that language is a code.
It is.
And if people don't understand that code, they can't communicate to themselves or to anybody else.
Yeah. And that lack of expression using that particular code being, I guess, the major code, as it were. If people can't do it, a lot of that leads to frustration.
Mm.
And so human beings, being the inventive creatures that we can be, find other ways of expressing ourselves. But you need others who know that code, or who understand that code.
Yeah.
And so very much, as you said, educators, we're educating ourselves in the codes of others as well, aren't we?
And our own code.
And our own code, yeah.
People talk about emotions all the time, which sets me off a bit, because to my mind, emotions are about meaning. And so I want to ask, well, yes, it's an emotion, but what does it mean by that? How are you creating your world from that response? What does it mean to you that then influences or dictates possibly
what's the other thing? Yeah.
So bringing all that into awareness so that it can be either accepted, adjusted, and then moved on. So can we and should we? Well, maybe we should. Maybe educator is the simplest word to use.
I think, for me, that sits much better with me. And I think of my work, and there's more of that. There's much more of that. But it's how we do it, isn't it? We don't. This is what to do. It's, and I guess this is where the enabling. All we do is provide. That's it. All we do. We provide a space, an opportunity for people to, I guess, for them also to practice their awareness of the code.
I think you're missing something out here. Maybe this is an issue for a different podcast. The majority of our profession is made up with women. And although that's correct, space and opportunity, what's missing is the acknowledgement of our own skill and experience, and owning that, and being proud to be expert at what we do, because that's the choice that we've made to focus on these issues. And that's what we bring to our clients. I don't know if that's a male, female thing, or Martin thing, or the idea that we actually should own that.
I think we should own it. We should own it.
Yeah.
Do you not think the balance is a bit more equal now?
Balance of what?
Male and female in our profession.
I think if you go to any counselling or psychotherapy training, it'll be 70+% women. A
I'm seeing a lot more men. A lot more men. Supervision groups, a lot more men.
And that means the style of the profession. Maybe that's where this whole regulation thing comes from, the desire to want to describe and measure and be clear about what it is that we're doing.
Possibly, yeah. And it, oh goodness, is highlighting, I guess, one of the differences between men and women, isn't it?
Well, possibly. I raise that as a question. And is that a cultural thing? If you put a group of men and women together, or children together, to develop their own culture, how would they organise themselves?
Interesting.
Nurture versus nature.
Moment,
I think space and opportunity and the willingness to bring our expertise and skill and offer it for the client is what we do.
Definitely.
Gosh, that was quick.
Hard to argue with that, though, isn't it? I mean, because we have gone on a journey, haven't we? We have gone on a journey by asking the right question, and this is it is exactly the same thing in counselling, isn't it? You ask the right question, and the rest just seems to open up.
Yeah,
we've explored a few other, this and that, but essentially, what is our job?
Yeah.
Which was the opening question. It's like, okay, You sit back and have a think. What is it? What is it I do? How do I do what I say I'm supposed to do, and so on? And you ask yourself of that. And as long as you're willing to engage with that process of discovery, of digging, of investigating, regardless of what is unearthed, the better you are. Okay, so goodness, I didn't know that was that. All right, okay, that's interesting. I'm going to have to look at that again because I didn't know. But and then that comes down to the individual. This is where the courage, the boldness, and that's what you teach your client. So yeah, definitely educator sits much more comfortably with me.
I think the other word that I would put in there, you talked about challenge, and people often do in psychotherapy training, but I'd also like to put in the word curiosity, just to be curious.
Yeah.
To be engaged, to be interested. Is that really the case? How did that come about? Without judgment.
Yeah. I had a wonderful supervisor many years ago. And he'd have loved this because he wasn't scared to be curious. But at the time he'd had many years of practice. And he never, he never saw himself as having arrived. So for him, and I think he was an octogenarian at the time, he was still on that journey of practicing, changing things, educating himself as well as others, and willing to engage with the process. He loved younger practitioners because that's interesting, and I think that's what a lot of us really appreciated about him.
I think he was
curious.
I think it was Arthur Rubinstein at about 90 or so. He said, concert pianist. He said, if I don't practice every day, I notice. If I don't practice every week, then my audience notices.
Exactly.
So,
yeah, definitely. Fully agree. So, yeah. And I always think, I was very fortunate to certain people, that's great. That's great, and how they take this on board. And maybe at the time they wouldn't have been able to describe just the way we have done today, what is our job, but they certainly did it, in a way that sits very well. And I look back then, I think, oh goodness, yep, I can see what they were doing. And boy, they did a good job of it then, because they, and they weren't stagnant. So this dynamism that we're talking about, very dynamic.
Absolutely.
Constantly,
evolving.
Yeah. Not afraid to ask the question. Ike, why'd you do that? Which is often my response.
But they hold the space.
Yeah.
It's not just...
And then they would equally ask the question, why didn't you do?
Yeah.
So they weren't worried about asking either question.
And the purpose of asking the question?
Lots of it to get me to think. There are options. There are, get me to own. Get me to. Well, they were educating me as well. And they would ask, well, what was it like when I asked you that question?
Yeah.
Did I feel, but it got me comfortable with hearing the question asked of me, checking my own. Okay. How do I feel about saying I don't know? Do I feel like an idiot in this group? Or if it's the truth, I don't know, what am I going to do with that? So I don't know. I'll ask Martin. Martin, so said, what do you think?
Somebody said that if education happens, then change happens, or if learning happens, then change happens. And that change can be either a difference or a reconsolidation of our own confidence.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what we do.
Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
I think we've illuminated it, if not come to a fixed or a focused, other than educator, answer. But I think it's as good as any, and we'll do for now, I guess.
I think so. Really good. It's a good one.
Thanks for your time, Mike.
Thank you very much, Martin. You have yourself a brilliant day.
I'll certainly try. what I'll do is... Thank you for downloading my podcast, Therapists Talking Therapy. I look forward to your company in the next podcast.